now, just to make sure we capture everything. Perfect. And you should all have a little pop-up to say that you consent to being in this recorded session as well. We seem to have had the numbers sort of stable for a little while, so we might get going, and anyone else who drops in can just pick up where we're up to. So welcome everyone again to our second session with Professor Craig White, our Associate Dean of Research, to update you on all things COVID-19. So thanks to everyone who did send in questions in advance. Craig is going to go through those and answer your questions and concerns in relation to COVID. And there will be, again, an opportunity at the end of the session, once we've answered the questions that have been sent in, for you to ask any additional questions. And if you do have additional questions that come up as we're going through today, please feel free to send those in a chat message. You can either send the chat to everyone, or you can also send it privately to me if you would like to. I'll keep a record of those as we're going, and then ask them at the end of the session. Likewise, at the end of the session, if you just send your questions through in the chat function, it'll be easier to manage them that way. Couple of other little housekeeping items. If everyone can just keep their cameras and audio turned off throughout, just to keep that internet connection going nice and stable. And also, you will have noted as you've been joining as well that the session is being recorded and will be made available afterwards through the Orbit page and also in the workplace group. So again, just keep an eye on that workplace group as well for this and any other updates relating to ECR matters also. Thanks again, Craig, for offering us your time again today to talk about these issues with us. It's very reassuring to be able to have this time and to be able to ask our questions to you. So I'll hand over to you to go ahead and answer those questions that we have had sent in.
Okay, thanks everyone for coming. I'm very happy to keep going with these sorts of things to answer as many questions as I can. And as with last time, I'll try and answer as honestly as I can, and I'll try and be honest where I don't know the answer as well, or where it's, I can tell you sort of what's going on, but where I can't influence it perhaps. So I think the first couple of questions were various variations on what the financial state of the university would be and what the impacts of that are going to be. Some of this is still a little bit of a moving feast. So the faculties received the information about what budgetary changes were necessary sort of earlier in the week, and heads of school had discussions with the dean later this week. And so not all of the plans to deal with it are in place. But the broad sort of overview is that, as you would have seen from the Vice-Chancellor's email, Monash is about 350 million short of where it expected to be. That comes largely down to a decrease in enrolments of overseas students. Within the faculty, we did quite well in that we maintained all of our domestic enrolments. And I think things like the Masters of Environment and Sustainability, which has a pretty substantial overseas cohort, actually increased. So at the faculty level, we did quite well, but the university is, I think, quite reasonably taking a one family approach to this. So the faculty has benefited in the past from Faculty of IT and Faculty of Business and Economics being really successful in recruiting overseas students. So we've shared the good times with them, and we're going to share a little bit of the pain with them as well, now that they're much more significantly impacted with us. And some of that flows through to the teaching that we do. So we have folk in mathematics who teach students from other parts of the university. So we have some direct impacts, but there's also the broader indirect impacts of the university. So Monash has had a downturn. We're not in as bad a position as some other universities where they've had it much worse. So the university did quite a good job of trying to, well, in my view, of trying to manage the impact of this. So right up until the census date, there were teams of folk holed up on campus, making phone calls to students who were looking like they were going to defer. And the numbers in terms of millions of dollars that meant that we didn't lose was actually very, very substantial. So we've had a really lot of efforts gone into trying to retain as many of those students as we possibly can, and that's reduced some of the impact, but we're definitely not short of an impact. So the specifics are, as I understand it currently, I don't believe Monash is looking at staff redundancies or anything like that. There are some other universities in Victoria that are talking about that being necessary. I don't believe it's going to be necessary at Monash, and some of the decisions that are being taken to try and prevent that from happening. So for an example, there was one question here, which was, will the budget shortfalls impact upon Monash research grants that are available in the coming years? And so one of the immediate impacts is that the Faculty of Science sort of research grant schemes that I run was scheduled to spend about $750,000 this year on internal funding schemes. The current plan is that that number will reduce to very, very close to zero. So we'll still continue to support things like leveraging LEAFs, linkage infrastructure equipment and facilities grants, but we're not going to spend that $700,000 on funding research programs through the C grant schemes. We're going to use that money to ensure that we can continue to pay staff salaries. So some of the decisions that are being taken are sort of a rediversion of funds. So that big pot of money, which was fun to splash around, is not available this year. The intent is that as things recover to whatever the new normal is, we will return doing those kind of activities. But this year we'll take a bit of a conservative approach and use that money to make sure everyone can continue to be paid on their current positions and contracts. The bit that I don't know so much about and is more difficult for me to comment on is going to be contract renewals and things like that. So folk whose contract are coming to an end and are being renewed, each of those is being evaluated on a case-by-case basis. And that's really just about ensuring that we have a think about what it is that we spend all of the money on. So we're thinking about those contracts, but we're also thinking about everything that we spend money on, right down to the sort of consumable level. And this is so that we can ensure that we have sufficient money turning around to pay the staff that we're committed to currently. And we'll have a proper think about those who are looking at renewals. So those discussions happen at sort of the head of school and dean level. So everyone who is coming up on contracts, needing them to be renewed, should be discussing those with their line managers, and the line managers is probably already discussing with the head of school. I know that I've had those discussions with my head of school about my stuff. So it's really about sort of prudent and cautious financial expenditure at this point to make sure that we get through this as unscathed as we possibly can. And then more broadly, we often hear discussions about questions that get asked about, could staff take pay cuts in order to make sure more money is available? It turns out, at sort of someone in my position, the enterprise bargaining agreement apparently makes that quite difficult, and our vice chancellor, as well as some other vice chancellors, are in discussions with the NTEU about what might be possible in that space in order to make some changes there as well. But I don't know what the outcome of that will be, because the enterprise bargaining agreement provides very strong protections for staff, and asking or encouraging or providing the opportunity for them to take pay cuts is not within the spirit of what currently exists. So I'm not across all of those details because those are happening at a much, much higher level. But I guess this is just about informing that all of those sorts of discussions that might take place are taking place at all of the levels of the university. So I'm just going to read through your questions. So the broad picture is that the financial impact is substantial, but not as bad as in some other universities. The intent within the university is to avoid redundancies, and it looks like that will be possible. As far as I understand it, that won't be something that we're looking at. And we are currently just trying to manage all aspects of expenditure as cautiously as we can to try and mitigate the impacts. And part of that is by not doing the faculty funding schemes this year. We will continue to do the ECR activities that we do. We were planning on moving some of those in-house anyway, and so we'll just keep them moved in-house. So we'll be protecting those kind of activities, and I would certainly like things like the mentoring scheme and all of the activities that we have to carry on. And so the intent is to keep doing that. There's a question about those who have, so yeah, if there are any questions, just pop them in the chat and I can either answer them as they come up, or we'll come back around at the end. There's a question for those who have children at home. There is apparently a procedure that if your employer confirms that you need to work from home, then the kids can go back to school. For those who would like to use this opportunity, who should they ask for this confirmation? So I am not aware of that procedure being in place. I did have a discussion with the research directors just before this meeting, some of whom who have children at home, and it seems that the major source of variation is school by school. So some schools, so it seems to be a discussion that happens at the school level about whether the kids can go back because the parents need to be at work. If the school requires some kind of information about needing to work, I would imagine the head of school, as the sort of the top of the line manager of most of us, will be someone who you could go to. So I would probably start perhaps with the school manager asking those kind of questions. And if it's a confirmation that's required, probably the head of school level will be the most appropriate person. But it did seem from the parents of children who I spoke to as the research directors that they weren't aware that anyone required that documentation, although it may just be varying principle to principle. Okay. So the next question was, are there any ideas about when we will be able to come back to work? So being as open and honest as I can, this has been a roller coaster planning this. So we've had a change in the way that the planning was taking place over Friday now. So in the last week, the plan has changed 3 times quite substantially. That seemed to be coinciding with that outbreak at the abattoir, where it sort of exposed how much risk there still is of clusters emerging in big organisations like ours. So the plan at the moment is that we are awaiting news from government, from Dan Andrews, which we expect to happen on Monday. So they're next having their meeting to discuss a relaxation of conditions in Victoria on Monday, and whatever Monash decides to do will follow any change that takes place at government level. So we don't know what's coming on Monday, and that's making it difficult to plan. But I would be expecting, if we have a relaxation to something like stage 2 conditions, then we would start planning, or we would enact the planning that's been ongoing for returning things like laboratory-based research to campus. So I would expect that the plan will remain. If you can work at home, then you should work at home, because what we want to do is be able to minimise the number of people on campus so that we can minimise the risk of many people catching it simultaneously, and therefore we can minimise the risk of buildings having to be shut, research programs having to be interrupted again. So the guidance will likely be, and this is all subject to Vice-Chancellor's announcements, it will likely be something like, if you can work at home, you should work at home. If your work requires you to be in the laboratory, we'll be planning to open laboratories and platforms in such a way that it's consistent, whatever the government requirements are. So something like social distancing, minimum number of people, or limits on the maximum number of people per unit of floor space, and appropriate signage saying how many people are allowed in each room. So it'll probably be something like that, and it will follow the sequence of whatever Dan Andrews announces on Monday. Then the Vice-Chancellor's executive group, or the Vice-Chancellor's group, will need to consider those, whatever the change is, make recommendations. The Vice-Chancellor will communicate, and then something will come out from faculty, which will allow us to put in some kind of operational plan to work with whatever it is that we're working with. So the idea is that, so we've been planning what we think it might look like, as I've just told you, for the last little while. So we have plans in place that we can enact reasonably quickly once we know what it is that we'll be enacting. And the idea is that we'll roll that out as quick as we can, making sure that everyone's safe. Having been someone who's been involved in these sorts of discussions over the last few days, there were certainly some sleepless nights trying to work out how to keep everyone safe while simultaneously getting people back into the lab. So the overriding principle is that we have sort of a private and a personal and public health responsibility, and we want to make sure we carry that out effectively while still allowing people to get back into the lab to carry on with their research. So balancing those is a challenge, particularly as things like laboratories don't allow people to drink and eat. So we need to think about how all of those aspects are managed, what the signage needs to look like, all of that sort of stuff. So yeah, we are working on it. We're working on it in a way that we hope to be able to get it in place relatively quickly once we know what the announcement is, but it's difficult to know exactly how fast, given we don't know really the conditions that we'll be under at this stage. So I would be thinking, if there's a relaxation on Monday, we'd probably be looking at, it won't be Dan Andrews says we're at stage 2, everyone runs into the campus. It'll be Dan Andrews says we're at stage 2, and then there'll be a number of days as the planning is finalised and signage is put in place and all of that. So maybe if we're, depending on the announcement, we'd be looking at sometime next week, the week after, possibly. But it's difficult to plan when we don't know quite what we're planning for and we're just trying to make educated guesses. But hopefully we're well prepared and we'll be able to move relatively quickly. So that's been a big chunk of my life over the last week. And then the final question on the new list is, do we have any advice about applying for DECRA either this round or the following round next year, if one is in their final year, given that the new one-year extension for eligibility? So I think my advice about DECRAs remains unchanged whenever I'm asked about these sorts of questions. It's really, don't try and game the system for some kind of perceived benefit. So one might think if you were in your last year that all of the other people will defer a year and so you have an advantage going early. But the reverse could always be true as well. So I think it's best not to try and optimize within these external factors. I think it's best to make sure that you always pick your timing based on your own sort of personal and professional circumstances. So I would imagine, and I would certainly hope, that relative to opportunity is going to be continued to be considered appropriately at the ARC College of Experts level when they make these decisions. So if the appropriate time for your personal circumstances is not to use that extra year because you are needing to find a job and your CV is looking in a pretty good place, I would say take that opportunity then. If the disruption or if the extra year provides you an opportunity to improve your CV and being able to hold off that year is also consistent with your personal circumstances, then perhaps holding off is the best thing. But I don't think I would be in a position to provide advice about whether or not there's a blanket recommendation that people should use or not use that extra year. I think it's use that extra year to make the best decision that you can within your own personal circumstances, rather than a blanket, everyone should wait or everyone should still go, because it's really difficult to predict how these things will play out. Okay. So there were a couple of questions from previous sessions. Some of those were about budgets and people on fixed term contracts. So I still don't believe that there will be sort of blanket extensions of folk on contracts to manage the interruption caused by the shutdown period. And I will refer each of those people who want to have those discussions to sort of line managers in order to talk about what possibilities there are within the funding constraints that I think line managers and heads of school will know more about now than they would have the last time we spoke. But there's been no word of Monash throwing money into a pot that could be used to extend those sorts of contracts. And by the same token, it's those whose contracts are expiring soon. The budgetary situation is becoming more clear, particularly over this week that's just passed. And so if your contract is expiring soon, particularly if you're on temporary sponsored visas, it's imperative that you're having conversations with your line manager at this time, because they'll, like, if they are able to provide contract extensions, then they'll be needing to make strong justifications for that. And so having discussions about what's going on is going to be important. Questions about timeframes on the use of Monash grants. So as with last time, the advice is the same. If people need to extend the internal funding schemes in order to, or the timeframe on the internal funding schemes in order to use the money later than they intended because labs are shut down and things like that, that's certainly fine. Just email the faculty research office with a justification and I'll be very likely to support that. We don't have plans to recoup money that isn't spent in that way at this time. And then advice for managing honours students that have very limited time. So part of the planning to get back on campus is to ensure that those students who are hoping to do an intensive project towards the end or in the sort of second semester of their honours year, and for those students that deferred and want to start in second semester, they're sort of at the forefront of our minds as we plan to be able to make laboratories as open as we can so that those folk can come back on campus and have the experience that they were really hoping for. And so, yeah, the advice is, at this point, we're hoping to have, subject to the government advice, we're hoping to have the labs open before too long. And so those students will be able to undertake those laboratory research projects. And so that's really all of the updates from me. It's just letting you know that I know that not all of the information flows through as clearly as we would like it to. Part of that is because, I mean, this week in particular has shown just how much of a moving feast it really is. So with regard to the opening up again, we've had 2 or 3 separate plans that are completely incompatible in place over the course of this week as the university-wide plans have been in place. And so I've been quite cautious about communicating what the plans are, just because I want the information to come out once and come out clearly, and then that to be the information that we follow. I don't want to send an email on Friday night saying this is the plan, and then on Monday saying the plan's changed again, and then on Wednesday saying it's changed again, because that's what would have happened if we jumped too early over the last couple of days. So Margaret and I have been talking about comms, and I'm going to try and pop an email out to folk on a Friday in the coming weeks in between these sort of Zoom sessions. I'll send it out maybe via Margaret, just so that I can just let you know as much as I can about what's going on, even if it's just to say, yes, we're still planning. Dan Andrews didn't say what we expected to say, and so now we've got to do a bunch more stuff that we weren't, and we're on top of it as best we can. But I'll try and communicate as much as I can, and if you do have concerns, you are more than welcome to just send me an email, craig.white@monash.edu, and I'm very happy to try and answer. My inbox is a dumpster fire, but those emails are appropriate and important, so I'll get back to you. And that's really it for me in terms of my rambling on. If anyone's got any questions, I will do my best to answer.
Great, thanks, Craig. I do have one question that's come through.
Yep.
So this is around ECRs being asked to step up and help with teaching, given the current lack of research perhaps available and need for perhaps extra support in teaching, and what your thoughts are around this, given that these ECRs are often on 1-year contracts, and unlike most other academics, don't have their own research groups to help them progress their research while they're teaching or doing all these extra preparations for teaching.
Yeah, so I guess without knowing the specifics, I would personally be hoping academics were doing the majority of that. And it may be academics who are stretched who are perhaps asking the ECRs to help out. So I guess there's 2 aspects to it. One is that this whole financial crisis exposes to us how important the students are. None of us have jobs without them. And so perhaps the opportunity to have contracts extended is to be influenced by how positive the experience we can give our undergraduates is, so that we don't lose any of them before next year and things get worse. So there is, in part, an all hands to the pump mentality, that there are those of us who are on continuing positions and our hands should probably be at the pumps first. Yeah, without knowing too much about the specifics of the situation that's being asked there, I can't really say much more than that. I would hope that academics are bearing as much of this as they can, but there is variation among even our continuing staff and how much they're able to do at the moment. People at home with small children are impacted more than me at home with 2 cats, for example. So I guess that's my broad perspective on it. If whoever asked that question is comfortable getting in touch with me to talk about it, either via email or we could Zoom or something, to provide some more focused advice for managing that situation, I would be happy to do that. But, I might need a bit
I do know of, several situations or people who have been in this position. And do you perhaps have any sort of recommendations or suggestions around how to just make sure that I guess contribution to the teaching is perhaps acknowledged and that break in the research is also acknowledged?
Yep, so that I can help with. So I recently just sat on a selection panel for academics, and whenever we read someone's CV, what is provided on that CV is, we don't go back to the institution that person did their postdoc at to check that they did this massive job that they said they did. There's a lot of trust in the system that we currently work in. So what I would say is keep track of what you do, make sure that it's recorded on your CV, and make sure that it's recorded as how your time was available for research whenever it is that you apply for other positions. So I would think it reasonable that every CV I read for the next 5 years says something like, ranging across the full spectrum from COVID-19 had no real impact and I had to work at home a bit, through to I was at home with 2 small children. My lab was closed and I had to help prepare teaching materials for my PI. And so I was unable to do research for 4 months, despite being in a research-only position. And so my opportunity for research has been XX FTE since the completion of my PhD. I think those sorts of statements are going to be front and centre when we read cover letters and when we read grant applications, and they should be. And so my advice would be write that stuff as clearly as possible. I think employers have an obligation to ask for it clearly and explicitly. So if you're applying for a position that says the selection criteria requires you to have a PhD, I would expect and hope that in the future everyone will be saying selection criteria 1 must have PhD. Please say when PhD was awarded and describe opportunity for research since then, so that people can put this kind of interruption in as well as all the other interruptions. My experience on selection panels is everyone really cares about that stuff and we want to know it, we want to make use of it, we want to consider it appropriately. So don't be shy about putting it forward and make sure you record it.
Yeah. And is there anywhere on any of the sort of internal Monash systems that it would be useful to record anything like that? For example, like the My Plan system where, you know, we record our sort of yearly goals and what we've achieved, or in Pure somewhere. I'm not sure if there's anything like that.
I think probably not Pure. I think My Plan for discussions with progress with line managers will be really important. And then keeping track of it yourself so that you can always report it when you need to for funding and jobs and things like that. But yeah, so certainly in the My Plan PD meetings that you have, it's important to discuss that because everyone's experience is going to be different.
Yeah. Okay. Were there any other questions that anyone had? That's the only one that's been sent through so far on the chat. Yes, here is another one. Can you comment on how significantly is the crisis affecting the hiring of new postdocs, and should we expect a smaller ECR community in the near future?
That's a good question. I guess it's hard to anticipate. I would think, so I think there's likely to be a couple of different avenues of potential impact. So the ARC and the NHMRC at this point seem to be carrying on with altered timelines, but not with altered budgets. And so the pipeline of positions through those avenues, I would expect to remain, at least for the next little while, for the next funding round perhaps, I would expect them to be pretty similar. There may come a time when Discovery Project, the Discovery Program, or the NHMRC programs have to contract because the government needs to deal with the reduced expenditure, but we haven't seen anything like that at the moment. The other avenue is the ones where we're having the most challenges at Monash at the moment, which is what's referred to as operationally funded positions. So an operationally funded position is basically where we get money from lots of international students. That money from international students partly cross-subsidises the money that we get from the ARC and the NHMRC because they don't provide enough money for proper salaries. But it also provides funds that's used to employ people completely out of university money. And that's the pot that's potentially the most challenging. So that's the one that we're much more constrained in spending this year. So all of the science faculty funding schemes are operationally funded, and that's why they were reduced from 700-ish thousand to nothing. So the opportunities that come through that pool are going to be restricted this year. Whether or not they're restricted next year depends on how things play out at a global scale. So on one side of that set of possibilities, it may be the case that international students just dry up everywhere and they start using their own universities. There are some great unis in some of the places where we draw our international student bodies from, and they may just stay home, not come to us. The other extreme of the possibilities is that of our international competitors in English-speaking countries, the UK and the US primarily, they are in a much worse position than we are with regard to COVID-19. So if Australia opens up its borders to international students and is perceived as being a much safer place to visit as an international student, we may actually recover quite quickly. So if that's the case, if we have a flood of large numbers of international students who would previously have gone to the US, but they don't want to spend time in the things that are going on over there at the moment, they may turn up here. And so we don't know how that will play out. So yeah, I don't know quite what the ARC and the NHMRC are going to do. The schools have thought I've been part of many discussions where Deputy Vice-Chancellors for research and people in my position are all trying to crystal ball gaze to work out what's going to happen. And the opinions in that space range from the politicians won't cut it because they like having things to announce and they want to cause a bit of a distraction, or right through to they were going to find a way to cut it and this will be their excuse. So it's really hard to know. I suspect it'll be pretty static. Those pools tend not to grow, but they also tend not to shrink too much. The operational funding is really dependent on what happens with enrolments over the next couple of years.
Yeah. I mean, at the moment, is it the case that Monash has a freeze on any new contracts? So we're not creating any new contracts at the moment.
So there's not a freeze as such. There's just a much higher level of approval is required. So people on the professional Hugh type scales require approval from the Chief Financial Officer, and people on the research scales require approval from the Provost. So heads make a case to the Dean makes a case to the Provost. So there's just watching every penny going on. So I wouldn't say it's a freeze, it's just a very cautious approach. But I imagine the outcome of that cautious approach will be a reduction in how many operationally funded positions are available in the short term.
Yeah. Okay. Did anyone else have any other questions that they'd like to ask? The chat seems to have been reasonably quiet.
And so I'm receiving some private messages of people of confirmation about business cases needing to be made.
Okay. So those are things that you'll probably address separately, I imagine then.
So it's just people confirming the process that I just said about Hugh staff going up to higher level final business case approval contracts and academic staff going up to sort of provost level. So it's basically, it's a justification about,
right.
So if you were, an extreme case might be if you were hiring someone to do a completely laboratory-based task 4 weeks ago, that would have been a difficult case to make given that there was no laboratory-based tasks taking place on campus.
Yeah. All right. Well, it seems like there are no more questions coming through in the chat. So I guess we will call it there then. So thanks again, Craig, for coming along and answering all our questions today. We can potentially hold another one of these perhaps in about another month or so. By then we might have a bit of an idea of how the return to work is kind of going to unfold. So it could be good to catch up again then. I'm happy to organise another one. But yeah, like I said, in about a month's time, unless there's anything major that sort of changes in the next 2 weeks or so. Otherwise, I think those emails sort of coming through around any changes from those higher levels will probably be adequate to keep us all informed, I think.
I guess what I might just quickly ask people is maybe to feed back to Margaret. One of the things that we're thinking about, so I think it was Wednesday, I'm losing track of time, we had a meeting of all the Associate Deans research across all of the faculties and Rebecca Brown. And one of the things that we talked about is trying to get an understanding of what went well and what went badly while we were sort of off campus over this last little period. And so trying to understand particularly what worked for people could be very useful just in case we do get a cluster in the future and we need to go off campus again, so that we can, share what works and try and avoid what doesn't. So learning from this experience will hopefully not be valuable because hopefully we won't be impacted to the same extent again, but if it does happen, it would be nice if we can help each other out by sharing that information. So if you do have things that were really useful, maybe if you could pass them back to Margaret, and then we can accumulate them, share those across the university. That would be great.
Yeah, I can put together a little quick survey form to send around
Cool. Yeah.
to people who weren't in this session as well. That'd be useful.
Yep.
Okay. I'll put that together today and send that around. So yeah, you can feed back any of that information, which I'm sure will be very useful if we do have to go through this again.
Yes.
Although fingers crossed that we don't.
Indeed.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining us. And yeah, a recording will be available if you do want to come back and revisit any of the things we've discussed. And last time there was a summary of the questions and answers that went around in written form as well. So we should be able to do that for you again. And we'll pop that up on Workplace and the Orbit. Otherwise, have a good weekend, everybody. Happy Friday. And we'll see you next time. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.